active engagement with the city? Does it make them kind of do something, pledge themselves to do something in the city? I was really curious about this, and I wanted to explore it more. And I'd already really been exploring it, and I was finding that there was something here. So I had these really in-depth interviews. I talked to 10 people, and I gathered all this data. I was doing research now, so I'm talking about my research. I had done these 3 interviews, but I also gathered writings from a lot of my participants had their own blogs, or we had a project blog. I gathered all these writings and read what people were thinking. I also wanted the place to come into my research and be a part of the analysis. We're talking about place. The place itself should be a part of this, so I gathered hundreds of photos over the history of the project, and I hosted a photo exhibition in Victoria where I had moved back home, and I would sit in this coffee shop where I had all my photos hanging and try to let the place kind of infect me. I did a ton of research about the history of the land. I gathered all these aerial photos, which you saw some of those earlier, and looked at how the landscape of that garden had shifted over several hundred years, and tried to get as much information about all that as I could. And so with all of this data, I sort of came to some findings. And so I want to share some of the interesting things with you that emerged for me out of doing this really interesting, what I think is really interesting research. So the first thing that I think this is what really surprised me about my research was the importance of the organizational structure of the garden and the way that order sort of emerged out of this project. Like I said before, that there was no allotments or anything. It was just whoever wanted to be involved came and got involved. And it created this kind of trust that was really unique for people. So it was a kind of trust where when people got involved and really started to be engaged with the project, they felt themselves trusting their own ability to be able to do something. People talked about how before they got involved in the project, they felt like they didn't have much to offer. They didn't really feel like there was much that they could do. But after being involved, they saw that, oh, actually, I have all these great things that I can offer a community, and I really do know how to do things. And so they came to this sense of trust in themselves, but also a sense of trust in one another, and really being able to see each other as whole, unique beings, and kind of seeing each other in this really true, trusting way. And the whole project is really founded on this notion of trust. So I thought that was really interesting. You can see what Adam says, that the ability to have a sense of structure and a sense of like the tools and frameworks to work with to construct your own education or to conduct your own learning, and to have a supportive community around that, that was really invaluable to the whole process and the whole experience of being involved in this garden. And so this kind of order that was led by people's curiosity, where people could kind of create their own little pods. If you were interested in starting an apiary, you could just do that. And that's exactly what happened. There were 2 people who wanted to keep bees. They knew nothing about keeping bees, but they did it. Now we have several hives and this thriving population of bees, and we produce tons of honey, And it was just led by people's curiosity and this sense of trust that you can do this. And all this kinds of stuff started to happen. It was really kind of cool and an interesting part of my research. And that organizational structure started to create this shift in the way that people saw the built environment. So they started to come to this new perspective on the city and on their place. So the first thing that people started to really, that I started to notice, is that people started to communicate with the more than human world. So this understanding that you can talk to plants, that you can talk to animals, and you can have this really interesting relationship with them. This is something that people were starting to see, and they were starting to notice how plants were changing in their communities, and the way they walked around and thought about the built environment was really starting to change because of this relationship that they started to form with the more than human world. They also started to be able to navigate the flows in the city. So the city is an intense place. There's all kinds of stuff coming at us all the time, noise, things in and out. It can be quite overwhelming. And a lot of people talked about, before being involved in the garden, they felt really kind of awash in this kind of flow of stuff. And being involved in the garden sort of helped them to harness and deflect these flows and be able to cultivate a feeling of living in abundance rather than scarcity. I thought that was really interesting. Another thing that people started to see was just that every landscape serves multiple functions. And so the way people were engaging with landscapes and the way they were seeing them was changing, and they were noticing those relationships more. And they were noticing how some spaces really promote multiple functions and other spaces promote, fairly few. So a concrete parking lot was a really impoverished environment compared to a food forest, where all these different kinds of relationships are happening. And it's not just for people. These are functions for all the more than human world. People really started to see that. And then the last thing that was really interesting was people started really connecting with the history of the land and the history of the space, and started to think about sort of the layered historical past that exists in every spot, and connecting to one's own ancestry. People talked a lot about the challenges that they were feeling as being from sort of a European settler heritage. And for a lot of my participants, they really started to engage with the colonial past of our land, and thinking about the history of every place, and how that impacts who they are now, and how they want to relate to those histories. And so one participant says that I've been thinking about what decolonization looks like, and people felt like this model that we were creating was kind of an interesting new way forward that was kind of sort of reformulating some of those historical narratives that people started to realize they were actually quite deeply rooted in, and created opportunities to challenge or to think about those in new ways. So that was really interesting, I thought. And then the last thing that really jumped out at me, I mean, not the last thing, there's all sorts of things I'm forgetting here, but something else that's really interesting was this connection that people started to make to that upon which they depend. So there's this sense that emerged from a project that the way that people were relating to what they needed was really changing, and people were starting to see that the whole notion of independence is just a total pile of hogwash. It's pretty much bullshit, right? Like, we are not independent, and our culture, our society is framed on this, like, independence is sort of like the epitome of what we should become. And people started to see that that's impossible, and that coming into these relationships of dependence where you're actually involved with the things that you're dependent upon created this whole new kind of perspective, and it really started to shift the way that people thought about a lot of different basic needs. So I created this kind of little chart.
How old were your participants? I mean, what is the age of these people who are saying these philosophical jewels?
So my participants were 16 years old to they're 16 to 32, and then there's one outlier who's 50, who's Matt Hearn, who founded the Thistle, is one of my participants.
Can you go back just for a second? I want to catch the last little bit of that. That statement is so really profound.
Yeah, so this is Adam. Adam is...
How old is Adam?
He's about 24, 23, and Adam is an incredible individual, really deeply wise young man, who was like the rock of the Thistle Garden for about 2 years, and he was there every day, and he grew all of the food he needed in this garden. He lived essentially on the very small amount of money he got as being a mentor for the garden. He was there every day. They paid him $500 a month to do this work, and that's what he lived on, and his rent was $400. So he said to me he spent his extra money on raisins. He really likes raisins. You know? he makes his own medicines. He harvests all of his own food. And you know, Adam, I think for me, is a really big inspiration, and for a lot of people in this project was a large inspiration. And yeah.
Is that really his name?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. If you go and find I have to use a fake name, but for this, I feel like Adam said it was okay to use his name. Yeah. Adam Huggins. He's an amazing guy. Yeah. So the way that people were relating to the things which they really needed was really changing. That instead of getting food from the grocery store and being kind of disconnected from the source of their food, people were starting to really connect with the roots of where their food came from. Same for all these other different things, and you know, getting into some of these more philosophical areas, like the structure of how you thought about your life was shifting from like a dependence upon economic sort of metaphors and just like tangible things to more of an ecological sort of metaphor for the